Okay, so this is the solar addendum. This is part of the purchase contract. If there are solar panels on the property, it would be disclosed in MLS, and then we would fill out this document based on a couple of factors. A, are the solar panels owned free and clear? Or does a utility system or utility company such as APS or SRP own the solar panels? That are currently on the roof, or is there a solar lease or loan against the property for the use of the solar panels? So depending on the ownership status of the panels would depend on how this document is filled out. So we'll start up here. Seller's name goes here, buyer's name goes here, premises address, date. And then this outlines the instructions of how this document and how we are supposed to use this document. So we'll start with section 1. Basically, section 1 is, does the seller own the panels free and clear? So therefore, buyer isn't assuming a lease payment. They're not assuming a loan payment. They're getting these panels. They're getting the benefit of the panels being owned free and clear on the property. Or does the utility company own them? So does SRP or APS, are they essentially paying to rent the use of the roof for solar panels? It happens, it's relatively common in certain parts of Maricopa County where you will see solar panels on roofs and the power company owns them. Typically, they'll give you a credit towards your bill for essentially the use of your roof for the panels. So depending on what the situation is, would depend on what kind of documents the seller provides. So within 3 days of contract acceptance, the seller is supposed to provide all documents that they have. So if it's documents pertaining to the owned solar panels or the documents that the seller signed or whoever signed, maybe it was a previous owner prior to them, signed with the utility company, those documents should be turned over also so that the buyer can determine what the terms of that agreement is and what they're inheriting at close of escrow. So within 3 days, that the seller disclosure is provided. So basically, all the documents that they have regarding the solar system are sent to the buyer. Once the documents are received, the buyer has a separate 5-day inspection period on these. So if it falls within the 10-day inspection period window that we review as part of the Benzer video or the purchase contract video, where I go more in depth on that. If it falls within those 5 days, then we just include it as part of the inspection period. If that 10-day window is, say, shortened for some reason, or the seller doesn't provide us with the documents within the 3 days that we're supposed to get them, then you would get a separate 5-day window to review the documents and ensure that you're comfortable with whatever it is that you're taking on as the new buyer. So if you don't like the terms that APS or SRP has set up for the house, you review the documents. You don't like the agreement that's been put in place that was agreed upon prior to you as the buyer making an offer on this home, you can cancel the purchase contract based solely on that. Or if the seller maybe misrepresented the size of the solar system or something, and you find out that the solar panels are older than you thought, whatever it is that you disapprove of, that is all handled within the 5-day window after receipt of documents. So here's your just initialing that you understand the situation here, what the timelines are. Now, with a solar lease or loan, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So with solar leases, the panels are not like once the lease is over, typically they're about 10, 15, 20 years. I think the most common term length that I've seen is 20 years. Once the term is up on the 20 years, the solar company would then just remove the panels and everybody would move on. Or there might be an option to buy the panels at the end of the lease or something along those lines. That's option 1. Option 2 is, which is relatively common also, we'll see a homeowner has put solar panels on the property. They decided they wanted to purchase them. They financed them at, whatever the interest rate was at the time of financing the solar panels. Usually it's a pretty attractive interest rate just due to all the incentives around solar panels, but there's a balance to the loan. So let's say they put on a $50,000 solar system to the home and they owe $20,000 against the home. You as the buyer would then assume either the lease payments or the loan payments, depending on what type of ownership it is. So this is really important. When it comes to solar panels on a home, Um, One of the most important things is the payment amount, because that is actually factored into whether it's a buyer qualification. So let's say a buyer is looking and their max payment is $1,700 a month. And then they find a house that they really love, and there's solar panels on the home, and the lease payment is $200 a month. Well, if that property doesn't fall under a certain amount, that $200 now factors into part of their mortgage payment. So their mortgage payment can't exceed $1,500, because we have to add in the additional $200 as part of the debt to income ratio. So it's really important with solar panels that we talk to the lender that we're working with to ensure that if we're looking at the very top of our budget, we find a home that has solar panels, that we are ensuring prior to writing an offer that the numbers make sense and it's something that we can make work with the buyer in order to have that deal go through. So I've seen it happen too many times where deals have fallen apart because they were pre-qualified, buyer was looking at the very top of their budget, they find a home, and the solar panel payment just pushes them over the edge. So it's a really important thing that as we're looking at properties, or once we get under contract, that before we even write an offer, or as a seller, we're accepting an offer, we're talking to the lender and making sure that the lender is aware that there are solar panels and what that payment looks like, so that everybody's all on the same page moving forward and the deal doesn't fall apart over that. The terms here are still the same though. Within 3 days of contract acceptance, the seller is supposed to provide the buyer with the most recent version of the solar system lease or loan paperwork. So whatever paperwork the seller has, they're supposed to provide that. They're supposed to deliver to the buyer all other solar documents in the seller's possession and provide the buyer with the name and phone number of the lessor. So if the panels are leased, then we have to start the lease transfer process. Sometimes every company is different on how this transfer happens. So sometimes the seller has to initiate it. Sometimes the buyer has to initiate it. Sometimes the title company can do it. It's very company specific. There's not really a streamlined process on this. From a real estate perspective, they're relatively new and everybody's still trying to figure out the best system that makes the most sense in terms of streamlining everything. And every company is different on what they require to process the lease transfer. So as a buyer, you have to go through a whole pre-qualification in order to ensure that you're capable of assuming the lease payments as well. So all of this documentation should be provided prior or within 3 days of contract acceptance. There's a contingency in there. So assuming that the buyer is unable to qualify through either the lender, well, actually both the lender and the leasing company, whoever's leasing the solar panels, if that happens and you're not able to qualify, then obviously the deal dies and we have to cancel. Everybody moves on. Buyer disapproval. So once the buyer reviews all of these documents, they have 5 days from receipt of the documents to determine whether they're willing to accept the terms of the solar lease and move forward with the deal. Same as above in section 1. And then from that point forward, we move forward if you're okay with the terms of the lease. Unfulfilled lease or loan assumption contingency. So again, the contract shall be canceled and buyer shall be entitled to a return of earnest money if, after a diligent and good faith effort, the buyer is unable to obtain loan assumption approval. So we already sort of attack the lease side here, and then there's a loan assumption here as well. So there's multiple contingencies. If something happens, same as your loan contingency for purchasing the home, if for whatever reason you're unable to assume the loan or assume the lease, then and the deal falls apart, you do get your earnest money back. But you do have to make a good faith effort to ensure that you're moving through the process and trying to assume the lease and working towards a full performance on the purchase contract. Sometimes there are transfer fees. So here, and again, every company is different on what those transfer fees are. So here we would mark whether the buyer is going to assume the transfer fees or the seller is going to assume the transfer fees. Unfortunately, there's nothing in there that says that we need to get those fees prior to writing an offer. So unfortunately, the way these documents are written, we go in blind, not really knowing who's going to be responsible. If I'm representing a seller, I always ask them to call and try to find out if they can get the transfer fees so that we can put a note in the MLS so everybody's aware of how much this is going to cost just to transfer it over. They do a soft credit pull to determine whether or not you fall within their credit guidelines to be able to assume the lease or the loan. So this is a credit score fee. Sometimes they charge an additional fee on top of that. And then the solar tax credit loan balance reduction, the seller shall be responsible for paying any required reduction in loan balances as it relates to the eligible solar tax credits that may be necessary for a buyer to assume the solar loan. So this is a complicated one because once the solar panels are put on the house, depending on what the tax credits are for the year that they were put on, the seller was supposed to receive a credit against their taxes, and that money was supposed to be applied towards the balance of the loan. That doesn't necessarily always happen the way that it's supposed to. So we have to ensure, did the seller apply the appropriate tax credit back to the loan balance to ensure that you're assuming a loan balance that's fair and not something that you're paying more on unnecessarily. And then here's additional terms and conditions. Because it's in bold, it's important. That's just how these documents work. Any change in the current rate plan made by buyer may result in increased rate or plan that is less favorable to the buyer. So if you make any changes to it, it's possible that it would end up being less favorable towards you. Seller, if the electricity or electric utilities are on at time of contract acceptance, sellers shall ensure they remain on through close of escrow. That's already in the listing agreement and in the purchase contract that the seller is responsible for keeping the utilities on. Should sellers seek to turn off electric utilities or change the existing rate plan at any time between the date of contract acceptance and close of escrow, and doing so results in increased rates or a plan that is less favorable to the buyer, including but not limited to the loss of net metering billing status, it shall be deemed a change in the premises under section 4L of the purchase contract. So if you go back and watch those videos, we talk about there are certain changes to the premises that can't be done. And if they are done, then that's grounds for the buyer to cancel. So it's important for the seller not to make any changes that would adversely affect the buyer at close of escrow when it comes to the solar panels. So this outlines some buyer due diligence that you should do: age, battery storage, end of lease and loan terms if applicable, what the grandfathered utility plan assumption is, where is it tied in, what's the homeowner's insurance, how much is that going to cost for the panels. Pretty much these are all things that should be focused on as part of the inspection period. And then again, an acknowledgement that because conducting due diligence with respect to solar system is beyond the scope of a broker's expertise, seller and buyer expressly release and hold harmless brokers from liability for any defects, conditions, or transferability problems pertaining to the solar system. So again, just knowing that we are not experts in everything. We're here to help guide you and help you through the process. But when it comes to solar panels, especially because they are so new, to our market over the last 10 years or so, we're still learning about them as well, but we'll never claim to be experts on solar panels. So here, again, you're just initialing certain things that pertain to you, whether you're the buyer or the seller. If there are additional terms, we write them here, and then you sign and date everything. So this just outlines sort of what your ability is and what your responsibilities are, what the timeframes are around those responsibilities to ensure that you're making a well-informed decision about the solar panels as we move through the purchase of the home.